this video, I will be explaining diagnostic criteria for developmental disabilities. We'll focus on intellectual disability and autism. So what we'll be talking about in this video is the definitional meaning of disability. There are diagnostic criteria from professional organizations that help us to diagnose both autism and intellectual disability. And then finally, I will discuss some ways that the conversation is shifting towards diagnostic criteria based more on a social model rather than a medical model that emphasizes deficits. So just to review, you'll find that definitional meanings of disability are very convoluted and often contradictory. Terminology related to disability has changed over time due to stigma that has been attached to the terminology. So you'll find that the common and current politically correct term is intellectual disability. However, in prior versions of the DSM, other terms were used like mental retardation. Disability is often defined by a combination of the following: diagnostic criteria that are set forth by professional organizations. This is what we're going to focus on in this video. In other videos, we'll focus on the other two listed here: policies that protect the civil rights of people with disabilities and policies that establish eligibility criteria for disability-related services. So there are many different professional organizations that have power in defining definitions of developmental disabilities. The one that social workers interact with the most is the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and we're currently on the 5th edition. Also, social workers come in contact with the World Health Organization's International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, or for short, ICD. The current versions of the ICD that are being used now across the world are the ICD-10 and the ICD-11. When we talk about these on other slides, you'll learn that even though practitioners like social workers and other mental health professionals are taught how to diagnose autism and intellectual disability based on definitions from the DSM, that whenever we code for services, for clinical social work services, we use codes that align with ICD. Very confusing, right? So another organization that is important in defining developmental disability is the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. And they have a publication that is in its 12th edition called Intellectual Disability Definitions, Diagnosis, Classification, and Systems of Support. And it is commonly used in the field of developmental disabilities. Some social workers have additional training in using this diagnostic criteria. Along with their diagnostic criteria, they also have developed tools for evaluating levels of functioning and needs for supports. And then these last two listed here are to show you that there are also specialized organizations that further define criteria within developmental disabilities. One of those organizations is 0 to 3. They have their own diagnostic classification of mental health and developmental disorders of infancy and early childhood. So that is specific to young children. And then the other organization listed here is the National Association for Dual Diagnosis, so Diagnostic Manual Intellectual Disability, DSM-ID-2. This is another more specific diagnostic manual for mental disorders as they present with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because often people with intellectual disability are not able to communicate their symptoms in the same way as people who are non-disabled. And whenever we specialize in mental health issues with this population, there are certain characteristics to look at. We're not going to focus on these last two definitions because these are very specialized, but I wanted to mention them to you and encourage you to do a web search of these two organizations if you have a particular interest in early childhood or in mental health. So, like I said before, social workers are commonly taught the DSM, and we're on the current edition is the DSM-5, but it's important to note the previous edition because there were a lot of changes with the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder. In the DSM-4 TR, it was based on 3 criteria or 3 categories of criteria: impairment in social interaction, impairment of communication, and restricted, repetitive, and stereotyped patterns of behavior. And also, it wasn't called autism spectrum disorder in this version of the DSM. Instead, there was a category of disorders called pervasive developmental disorders, and those included Asperger's disorder, autistic disorder, Rett syndrome, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. Asperger's disorder is what we now consider to be autism spectrum disorder level 1, or autism spectrum disorder without language impairment and without cognitive functioning problems, or without intellectual disability. Autistic disorder was what is sometimes referred to as classic autism, so where the person has significant issues with language. That was the main difference between autistic disorder and Asperger's disorder, was whether a person had verbal language and their intellectual capacity. Rett syndrome is a very specific pervasive developmental disorder that is still under neurodevelopmental disorders in DSM-5, but it has a genetic cause, and it is predominantly found in girls, and we've really realized over time that it's its own separate disorder. And then pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified were the people who met some of the criteria but not all, and it was still affecting their functioning, their adaptive functioning in their lives. So when we've moved to the DSM-5, you'll see that there are 5 criterion, and there are 2 major categories. So we've gone from 3 to 2 main categories, and those 2 categories are social communication deficits and fixated interest in repetitive behavior. For criterion A, there are 3 specific items that all of them have to be met. For criterion B, there are 4 items and 2 of them have to be met. Also, this has to begin in early childhood. It has to impair adaptive functioning, and it can't be better explained by intellectual disability or global developmental delay or any other condition. So this is another way to look at and conceptualize diagnostic criteria of autism from the DSM-5. So you will see right here that we have the 2 core dimensions, and as I mentioned before, that's a shift away from the DSM-4 TR where there were 3 core dimensions. They've made it into 2, and one is social communication, and the second is restricted and repetitive behaviors. For each one of these core criteria, when you make a diagnosis of autism, you also have to indicate a severity level for each one of these criteria. So for social communication, you have to indicate whether it's level 1, requiring support, or 2, requiring substantial support, or 3, requiring very substantial support. So you can see these severity levels are very ambiguous and open to interpretation about what falls into each one of these categories. For an autism diagnosis, like I said, you'll see a severity level for social communication, and then you'll have a severity level for restricted and repetitive behaviors. So you'll see 2 severity levels. It could be that someone is at level 1 with social communication impairment, but is in level 3 for requiring very substantial support for restricted and repetitive behaviors. So that presentation of autism sometimes gets misdiagnosed as OCD whenever those social communication impairments are missed. And then the other criteria, as I mentioned in the last slide, is that it has to be present in the early developmental period. So that's typically age 22 or before. The symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And then also, these disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability or global delay. You'll see here on the far right-hand side of this chart that these are all of the specifiers that need to be indicated whenever a diagnosis of autism is made. The first one is with or without accompanying intellectual impairment, so whether they also have intellectual disability or not. With or without accompanying language impairment, so whether they are able to communicate with verbal language or not. Is it associated with a known medical or genetic condition or environmental exposure? And when it is related to a medical condition, this is when you would also list that condition. So a common comorbid condition with autism is epilepsy. So you may see that come up here. Fragile X is a genetic condition that is linked to autism. You also may see Fragile X listed on someone's diagnosis if that is a known cause of their autism symptoms. This is very unusual. This doesn't happen very often where there is a known cause, because autism, we don't know a lot about the causes, and it seems that it's multidimensional, that it's both genetic and environmental, and that the interactions between a person's genetics and their environments are what make autism present or not. So it would be unusual to see a specifier because it's very unusual for us to know exactly why a person has autism or not. And then associated with another neurodevelopmental, mental, or behavioral disorder. So this is where you list any comorbid conditions that the person has. And some common ones are ADHD, anxiety disorder, developmental coordination disorder, disruptive behavior disorder, impulse control disorder, conduct disorder, depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, tics, Tourette's, self-injury, feeding disorders, elimination disorders, and sleep disorder. And then lastly, you specify whether catatonia is present or not. And if it is, then you add the specifier with catatonia. In this slide, this gives you a visual representation of what I just presented to you. So you'll see that autism spectrum disorder has these two major categories of impairments or symptoms. There are social communication deficits, and then in the second circle, there are restricted interests, repetitive behavior, sensory sensitivities, insistence on sameness. You'll also find here at the bottom that not all the way inside autism spectrum disorders, but kind of on the outside, this is where we have related modifiers. So intellectual disability, we would specify whether it's they also have severe ID, moderate ID, mild to borderline ID, average intelligence, or above average intelligence. I've mentioned in other videos that my son was recently diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder level 1 for both social communication and for restricted interest. And for him, he is an average intelligence to above average intelligence. So on his report, it said without intellectual disability. Then we also look at language skills. So either they're minimally verbal, they have some language, or they fluently speak. And my son falls into this category where he fluently speaks. And then adaptive functioning. This is where those specifiers come in for each one of these categories. And do they require substantial support, moderate support, or are they independent? And my son falls in these two. So he was diagnosed with level 1, so it's expected, since he has fluent language and normal intelligence, that he likely will need some support, but will be independent. So you'll see on the outside of the circle, these are all comorbid conditions that can show up with autism. In the red ovals, you'll see psychological related conditions, and then in the green text, those are medical conditions. So the medical conditions that can show up with autism are GI disturbances. So many people with autism have also a diagnosis of celiac disease, or they have celiac sensitivities. Also, even if a person doesn't have celiac disease or gluten intolerance, they still may have GI disturbances. I've worked with a lot of kiddos that really struggle with constipation. And you can imagine that a lot of behavioral issues could be related to that, because that can be a very uncomfortable situation. So we have to really look at the underlying reasons for behavior. Then sleep disturbances. People with autism tend to have more difficulties with falling asleep and staying asleep. Also, epilepsy is a comorbid condition, so seizures, especially absence seizures, can be common in autism, and it's something to really look out for whenever you're working with this population. Then genetic conditions, like I mentioned before, one of the most common ones associated with autism is Fragile X. Another one that is related to autism is 22q1 duplication and deletion syndromes. Those are genetic conditions that also lead to some presentations of autism. And in my blood family, I have some relatives who have this particular genetic condition. So we will get my son tested for that, just to get more information about whether he has that condition and if that contributes to his difficulties. All right, then for the red irritability, ADHD is also very commonly comorbid with autism spectrum disorder. I suspect that my son does have ADHD as well. When diagnosing autism with DSM-4-TR, it was thought that you could not diagnose both ADHD and autism. And now in the DSM-5, it allows for you to make a diagnosis of both at the same time. You just make sure to put in your specifiers that, along with autism, they also meet criteria for ADHD. And then some other things that go along with autism spectrum disorder are anxiety and depression. I find in my clinical practice that anxiety and depression usually is related to masking. Masking is a phenomenon where neurodivergent people, adapt to social situations and camouflage. So they may, really study other people and, get social scripts from people based on what they say to know what to say in another situation. And so a lot of times it can be hard, especially whenever somebody has an average to above average intelligence, to really get to the bottom of the autistic tendencies, because they have lots of compensatory symptoms. So they're very smart, so they found ways to blend in and to fake it, but that comes at a cost. And that's what I really see in my clinical practice. There's a lot of anxiety, depression, to the extent of, suicide attempts, and really low self-esteem. And I really attribute these two things to the stigma that comes along with autism, which we'll talk about in some later slides, that are really taking the diagnostic criteria and translating it into more strengths-based language. And then also OCD is a common co-occurring condition. like I said before, even though clinicians learn how to diagnose autism using the DSM, just to make things complicated, Medicaid, Medicare, and every major insurance plan requires social workers and other clinicians to use a completely separate coding system called the ICD. And in the United States, we are still using ICD-10, and ICD-10 was based on DSM-4 TR criteria, so there are still remnants of that. One code is 84.0 autistic disorder. This is now with DSM-5, all forms of autism spectrum disorder fall under this code now, since we've changed to the DSM-5, even though another code, 84.5, still exists called Asperger's disorder. This is no longer billable, and this is to reflect the changes in the DSM-5. But also, it's not really true, because I have lots of clients that I have to code as autistic disorder who really meet criteria for Asperger's disorder, but this is what insurance companies pay for, is autistic disorder. This will be changing in 2022 whenever Medicaid and Medicare are making the switch to using ICD-11, which the rest of the world already uses. So when we do implement this in 2022, this is what the codes will look like. It'll be 6A02 autism spectrum disorder, and then there are codes of 0, 1, 2, 3, and 5 that specify different combinations of whether or not a person has language impairment and whether or not a person also has an intellectual disability. On this next slide, I've mentioned intellectual disability a lot because it is a modifier that we use for autism, the autism diagnosis. And so I wanted to spend a little time talking to you guys about what the diagnostic criteria for intellectual disability are. So you'll see on this chart that this, tells you some information based on severity category. That is an artifact of the DSM-4 TR, which only, made these severity levels based on IQ. So it was real simple to look at the IQ test and to see mild, moderate, severe, profound, but it also didn't give us a lot of information about what kind of supports the person needed. It's beyond the scope of this video, but IQ tests have inherent flaws in them and can be very biased and can make certain groups of people seem to score as having intellectual disability when they really don't. So think about low income people who may be in schools that are not teaching students everything that they need to know. Also, students who are not native English speakers also are often diagnosed with intellectual disability when in fact it's just a language issue that they have, and it doesn't have anything to do with their intellectual abilities. So the DSM-5, you'll see, really tried to move away from just looking at IQ tests because there's so many problems with IQ tests, and to look at what kind of supports a person needs. So for mild, it's that somebody can live independently with minimum levels of support. For moderate, independent living may be achieved with moderate levels of support, such as those available in group homes. Severe requires daily assistance with self-care activities and safety supervision. And then profound requires 24-hour care. The last two columns here refer to the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities criteria. Like I mentioned in an earlier slide, they have a publication that's in its 12th edition on the definition of intellectual disability. And they also define severity categories based on levels of support. The language that they use is a little bit different than the DSM-5, but it's still similar that it's based on intensity of support needs. So for mild ID, it's intermittent support needed during transitions or periods of uncertainty. So not needing support all the time, but whenever there's a big life change. Moderate, limited support needed in daily situations. So this might be someone who needs a caretaker to come to help them to cook their dinner or to drive them to work. So there's some things that they need daily support with. Severe is extensive support needed for daily activities, and then profound is pervasive support needed for every aspect of daily routines. Then this last category is referring to Social Security criteria, and we'll talk about this in another video when we discuss eligibility criteria for disability-related services. But you'll find that there's really two specifiers here. There's mild and then there is not mild. And when it's mild, it is based on IQ, and it is, people who are at maybe a borderline intellectual disability, and their IQ can be between 60 and 70. For all of the, for intellectual disability, not just borderline, it is a valid verbal performance or full-scale IQ of 59 or less. And so verbal and performance are two parts of IQ test. And when they say full scale, that means considering both verbal and performance. But even if a person has higher on their verbal, if their performance is lower, they could still qualify, and vice versa. All right, so as we've discussed in other videos, we as social workers are really shifting more towards a social model of conceptualizing autism, and these diagnostic criteria that I've just explained are very heavily focused on deficits and are rooted in the medical model. But as you saw in other slides, there are really a lot of problems with that, and it doesn't take into consideration, in relationships and social communications, that there is another person involved in a social communication. So that's one of the biggest arguments, with autism, is that there's a double empathy problem. So a lot of times people will say that people with autism don't have empathy or are not able to be empathetic, when in actuality, we're finding in more recent research that autistic people can be very empathetic with other autistic people and communicate very well with one another. However, problems arise whenever it's a mixed neurotype communication, and it's a neurotypical person and an autistic or neurodivergent person that are trying to talk and to communicate. That's when the problems come in. So the double empathy problem refers to the fact that the neurotypical people also are having a hard time empathizing with the autistic people. It's not just that the autistic people can't understand the perspective of the neurotypical people. And that's more of a social issue. That's more of a civil rights issue. And so there's really two things I'm going to talk about that are moving more towards a social model of autism. So first, I'm going to give you an example of how there are now actually autistic clinicians and autism assessors who have come up with new ways to describe autism in a strength-based light. And then the second thing we're going to talk about is the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health, the ICFs. They're also part of the World Health Organization. That model has created an assessment called the HUDAS 2.0, and you may recognize this from the DSM-5 because that was another big change in the DSM-5, not just for autism, but across all diagnoses, is that we moved from using a general assessment of functioning, or GAF score, to it being recommended to use the HUDAS. What I've seen in actual educational settings is that social work students are not getting the exposure that they need to the HUDAS too, and that this is kind of being brushed off and not emphasized in our differential diagnosis education. But it's something that is really aligned with social work values and with social work practice. So I'm going to share with you one translation of DSM-5 criteria by a autistic psychologist named Matt Lowry, who does psychological evaluations for kids and adults. This is one meme that has gone viral that he created that shows how autism is more than just the two categories that we see in the DSM-5. So it's more than just the social communication and the restrictive, repetitive behaviors. So the things that he's identified is interoception. That is our ability to sense what's going on inside us. So being able to know if we're thirsty or hungry or need to use the bathroom. And also our awareness of our own emotions. Then emotional intensity is another category. So this is characterized by meltdowns, shutdowns, overload, situational mutism. So whenever people are unable to speak, and then also hyperactivity. Communication differences, relationship differences, executive functioning, spins or special interests, internet research, and information hunger and collections. STEMs, which is a shortened name for stimming, which is related to energy regulation, repetitive movement, and sensory seeking. And then finally, exteroception, so being able to sense the outside world. And a lot of autistic people are either hypersensitive or hyposensitive to their environments. So let's look at what Matt has come up with in his translation towards a strength-based definition of the DSM criteria. So he uses the same two categories and the same 5 criterion, but it's just written in a strength-based way. So A, different social communication and interactions as evidenced by the following: differences in communication. So not deficits in communication, but differences. So tendencies to go off on tangents, tendencies to talk passionately about special interests, a tendency not to engage in small talk. Differences in nonverbal communication. So this is like deficits in eye contact, but he explains it here in a much more affirming way as stimming while talking, looking at something else while talking, or being bored in conversations. And due to the differences in communication, autistic people tend to be shunned by neurotypicals and therefore conditioned to believe that they're somehow less social. The second category, repetitive behaviors or interests, as evidenced by the following in at least 2 of the 4 categories: stimming or engaging in echolalia, security and routines. So autistic people do not have a good sensory filter and end up having issues with sensory sensitivities. So often the world is perceived as a constant state of chaos, and routines and expectations give comfort to overwhelmed autistic people. Special interest or spins. Due to a hyper-connected brain, autistic people often feel more passionately about what they love, and when they have a special interest, they tend to fawn on and fixate on them. And then lastly, hyper or hyposensitivity to sensory stimuli, and he explains it as due to hyper-connected brains, like with spins, that autistic people feel things more intensely. Sometimes, however, autistic people feel things less intensely because they tune them out in favor of other stimuli. So, for example, some autistic people may, have a really hard time with processing auditory stimuli, but are much more sensory seeking visually and are able to read and to get information visually better than they can auditory wise. And then lastly, this is how he describes the other characteristics. See, autistic people are born with these traits, but they learn how to mask them, like I mentioned earlier, and sometimes they only show up when they're stressed and they let their guards down. D, these traits cause other people distress. So, you'll note in the DSM that it's impairment is only indicated when it affects other people or their jobs, but not when it's a daily issue for the person who's experiencing it. So these traits have to cause other people distress for a DSM diagnosis to be given. And then lastly, it's not due to intellectual disability. So I'm going to lastly give you some information about the WHODAS. I encourage you guys to do an internet search and to find the WHODAS and to practice, going through the questions just with yourself. You can do it for any type of disability or any of the DSM-5 diagnoses. It's not just for autism or intellectual disability. It's a generic assessment, and it's used across all diseases. It's short, simple, easy to administer. It takes about 5 to 20 minutes. It's applicable both in clinical and general population settings, and it's a tool to produce standardized disability levels and profiles. So we're able to see more of a profile of a person, not just they're autistic, but what are the things that they have trouble with? What are the things that they need more support with? And the WHODAS 2.0 is directly linked to the concepts that come out of the ICF model. These are the 6 different domains that the WHODAS looks at. And this, you can see that this is much more detailed and gives us a lot more information about a person than just whether they're autistic or not. We learn more about cognition, about mobility, getting around, self-care, so hygiene, dressing, eating, safety, being independent, getting along or interacting with other people, life activities, so being able to keep up their house, to engage in leisure activities, to work and go to school. And then participation, so being able to join activities and actually participate in those activities.